welcome to the show. And I love having a variety of guests like the one I have today. You know, I've had other authors and PhDs on the show and those kinds of experts. And so make sure to check out some of my other episodes if you're new to the show. And also make sure to subscribe to the show on YouTube so that you keep up with future episodes, because I plan to do more like this and having authors and experts and things like this. So my guest today, Dr. Dean Radin, he's currently a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and he's written several books and has been published in over 100 scientific journals studying what's called psi phenomena, which is the aggregate of parapsychological functions of the mind, including extrasensory perception, precognition, and psychokinesis. I hope I said all that stuff right. We are just going to scratch the surface on this stuff today, so do yourself a favor and read his books. Real Magic and Entangled Minds are the two that I have delved into. I'm almost done with Entangled Minds, and there's some other ones as well. He also has other interviews that you can find, and just really fascinating topics. And he's done some very important research that's all backed up by science. This is not fluff. This is real stuff. You'll see his research methods. They're very sound methods, and they're statistically significant. So I'll let him explain more of it because he does a better job than I do. There you go. Please welcome Dr. Dean Radin to the program. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, if I could real quick, I just want to kind of give a little bit of your background and how you got to this point. And obviously, I mean, you have a PhD, so it's very credible. I just want to make sure I point that out to people because I think there's obviously some perceptions about this topic. So you started when you were just a kid, you got interested in sci-fi and fantasy, but then it was a librarian that gave you a parapsychology book.
Right. Yeah, she saw that I was reading lots of science fiction and fairy tales, and I was, 12 or 14 or something. And she said, "Oh, you might be interested in this too," which was this book on parapsychology, scientists who were testing whether these things were just fantasy or real. And that really caught my imagination because, like a lot of kids, you're thrilled by the stories, but you don't have a sense that it's real because you don't see that.
Right.
But I was also a fan of science and technology, so she thought I might be interested, and she was right.
Okay. So then, because you got your bachelor's degree and then you got a master's in electrical engineering, and then you went and got the PhD in psychology. They probably didn't have as many of those programs back then for parapsychology and things like that, right?
There's never been any programs for parapsychology. There's no accredited university in the world where you can get a degree to study these things. You can get degrees in associated areas like transpersonal psychology. There are a couple of places that you can get a degree. And in fact, I'm a professor of transpersonal and integral psychology as well. But there are no departments on this topic.
That seems so silly though, because you've written, I can't remember how many books it is. I think I've read 2 of them. And you have over hundreds of articles published, and these are in scientific journals, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if anybody still doubts your credibility, you've been on Oprah and Larry King. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. So for some people, that's the ultimate.
Well, Oprah and Larry King are not exactly scientific outcomes, but
true.
More importantly, I've given talks to most of the Ivy Leagues, to Cambridge University, to lots of places that are in the academic world, including the National Academy of Sciences. So the strange thing about this topic is that there's about 15,000 institutions of higher learning around the world. Of them, about 40 are known for having a faculty member who is interested in this topic. We're talking about psychic phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
So the strange thing about that is that you can tell from our entertainment business that there are thousands of movies and television shows and novels that have themes that have to do with psychic phenomena. So it's part of the popular culture. A lot of people are interested in it. We know students are certainly interested in it. And yet it is studiously avoided. It's willfully avoided in the academic world, primarily because it doesn't seem to fit with the worldview that is taught in the academic world.
Mm-hmm.
And this is true. And in any area of scholarship, that when you're pushing against the status quo, whether it's in the academic world or politics or anywhere else, you get an enormous pushback. And so there are many things out there that are very interesting. Probably the closest analogy I can think of is UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
The people have reported UFOs forever. There's a lot of public interest in it, a huge amount of media in it, vigorously denied by the government and by the academic world for a long, long time. Well, that's breaking down because finally the government has admitted what it knew for a long time. Yeah, they're UFOs. We don't know what they are. Well, the same, I think, will happen eventually for psychic phenomena because they're very commonly reported. Lots of academics and scientists have these same experiences that everybody else has, but there's a taboo about talking about it, just like there was for UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
After enough time, when people begin to recognize that their experiences are not really that strange because they're common, and the nature of the scientific data gets better and better, which it is, that taboo will break as well.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, I think it may be too that there's kind of this all or nothing kind of mentality where it's like, for example, like, because I know you talk about the random number generators, and before that they use the dice. So just to try to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but to try to use a crude example, like with a dice outcome. So it's like, you got a dice with 6 numbers on it. You have a 1 in 6 outcome of guessing, focusing on the number 3, right? Well, if somebody, uses some psychic phenomenon and they can get that number 3 to occur more than 1 in 6 times, that's statistically significant. But I think people think, well, if you're truly, if you had this power, you'd be able to get, you'd make it a 3 100% of the time. Well, that's not happening. But I mean, it's even some sort of change that it could be statistically significant, correct?
Well, you ask somebody, why are you interested in sports? Your favorite sports star is really good, but they're never 100%.
Mm-hmm.
Favorite sports team is never 100%. Well, why is that? Well, because people are variable from day to day. That's the excitement of it. It's the random element in there. The best athletes in the world, even at the level of the Olympics, some of them are incredibly good and they are not guaranteed to win. So the idea that these phenomena should be so reliable and strong that you should be able to basically be a superhero is just ignoring the fact that humans are variable. And in this case, we're talking about a rather subtle form of perception and memory. So it's not surprising to me or to anybody who studies things like subliminal perception and other forms of things that can bias the way that we perceive the world. The fact that you can demonstrate that something is real does not mean that it's only 100% real. So that's just a silly argument.
Right. And that's what you're proving with these experiments, because you're using the scientific method and you're statistically proving it, correct?
Yeah. In science, we don't talk about proof. We only talk about proof when you're talking about alcohol or logic. Science is all about collecting evidence and
yes,
making your best guess as to what exists versus what doesn't exist. And so sometimes we'll publish a study and we'll show, like a medium, for example, we'll get 5% over chance, which is statistically significant, but it's only 5% better than chance. So if somebody could say, well, it's a fluke. Well, no, it's not a fluke. That's why we do the statistics, to show that it's not chance. But then they'll say, well, it's so small and weak. Why would anybody care? That's a confusion between the reality of something and our ability to detect it. So if we're dealing with a noisy signal, which a lot of the psychic stuff is, it's sort of noisy, it's really difficult to get highly reliable in-your-face kinds of evidence. But that's okay. Almost everything we know about the way that humans behave is very noisy and oftentimes difficult to demonstrate that it's a real thing. So this area has been repeatedly mentioned by my colleagues around the world. These kinds of phenomena are perfectly amenable to scientific study, and the size of the effects that we see are very compatible with ordinary effects that people see in psychological studies. So,
Yeah, no, and you mentioned in your book the director of The Exorcist, and he was showing real videos of exorcism. What is your take? Are you familiar with that case? Because it seemed like there was a lot of documentation from doctors and scientists observing things in that it was actually a boy in the real life case that they could not explain. It's sort of objects moving and things like that.
Yeah, I know what you're referring to, the director of The Exorcist. And I don't think that there was anything that was obviously paranormal going on. But the change in behavior of the patient was very dramatic, dramatic to the point where how can a human be doing this? So that's a little bit different than saying things are flying around the room. I mean, we're always biased by the way the media portrays
Mm-hmm.
these things. The real world generally is not that dramatic. But if you haven't seen somebody go through what appears to be a possession case, it's freakish. And I'm sure that's what freaked him out too, that people apparently become somebody else.
Have you seen one of those like in real life or only on videos?
Only in videos. And it's disturbing. Like you need to be a psychotherapist who knows how to deal with that sort of stuff to be comfortable in that situation. And I'm not. I'm a scientist,
Mm-hmm.
so I tend to stay away from the spookiness of the real world, and I'd rather look at it in my laboratory. This is not to say that I haven't done field investigations, because I have.
Mm.
I've done haunting investigations in a supposedly haunted bar in Kentucky, and also a castle in Sweden and a castle in Denmark. So the two castles are more interesting than the bar, partially because they were 700 and 800 years old, and more importantly, both of them were bases for the Nazis during World War II. And then the basement, the dungeon version, they had used as a jail. So these were not pleasant histories of these places, and they had legends of people being walled up, killed and walled up in the walls, things like that. So we spent about a week in each case looking at these castles, and it's easy to freak yourself out. So yeah, so I mean it was kind of fun, but the yield in field investigations is approximately 1 hour of good stuff for every 1,000 hours that you use.
Hmm.
So I figured this is not too efficient. I don't want to
Okay.
spend my life doing this. In the laboratory, you get good data in an hour,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I don't, time's short.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So like you said, we talked about magic is it's so popular. It's a multi-billion dollar business. But you had an interesting point about your book about how there's also like Harry Potter's the most popular book, but also the most banned book. Like there's a lot of like this, trying and you said this was shocked me that witch hunts, everyone knows about those, but you said that that's still happening in some parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
That's shocking to me.
Yeah, there was just an article the other day I saw, I think in Borneo. So in places that are considered third world, typically, a lot of people are still, if something goes wrong in the community, like this, we see this right now because of COVID, that if people start getting sick, some person will be blamed. Not that there's things that, they're not thinking about viruses and all that stuff. They're thinking that somebody caused this. They will find somebody, whether for whatever reason, and they will stone them to death.
Mm.
And this is happening today. This still happens around the world. And it's not too surprising that it's happening, because not just for COVID, but for lots of reasons, that this has persisted for a very long time. And this is why people wear amulets of protection. And I mean, in some cultures, you see it everywhere, that you see all kinds of protection things constantly, because of the sense that from a pre-scientific society, most things that happened were not understood, right? They were attributed to the gods, they're attributed to demons, they're attributed to all kinds of things, because things just don't happen, that something made it happen. So this is still true, even in a scientific sense. You say, well, somebody got a disease. Well, it's probably not a spirit. It may be a virus. And so we can do studies on that and find, sure enough, there is a virus. So, we're still at the point of always looking for causation. And in pre-scientific societies or societies that are not paying much attention to science, they will find a reason, and it's often a person, and that person is going to be very unlucky.
Oh, that's sad. Yeah, it's just, I think it's so important to keep an open mind. I mean, because if we look at the history with science, I mean, they used to say the world was flat. And if everyone just believed that, I mean, we'd still wouldn't know. So it's kind of, I think I like to learn new stuff, even if, there's a taboo about it or whatever.
Yeah, and in the old days when people thought the world was flat, it took explorers to challenge that, right? So because you wouldn't want to go to the edge of the world and fall off, and some people said, well, let's find out. So we're still in the same position now. That's why people want to go into space, and that's why there's people looking at the edges of what is known, and the exploration is fun, and it also carries risk. In this case, the risk is not so much that you're going to fall off the edge of the world, but you incur the wrath of the status quo, because the status quo likes the world the way it is.
Well, it's like we like to pretend like we know everything, but in my opinion, I don't think we know anything. And you use this quote in your book from Albert Einstein, who said, "Uncertainty rules the world."
It's true. Yeah. And I agree with you that in terms of what we think we understand at this point, given that science is a very good method of understanding things, it's only 400, maybe 500 years old. And humans have been around for maybe 300,000 years on a planet that's several billion years old. So it's really only arrogance that causes people today to say, well, we more or less already understand everything. If that were really true, then why are we spending maybe $100 billion a year on cancer research? We don't understand that too good. Why are we spending $10 billion a year on particle physics? Well, we don't understand that either when it comes down to it. There are lots of things that we don't understand very well, but it gives us a sense of comfort to think that we kind of have a handle on it. Everything's okay. It's a matter of personal control and comfort to imagine that we know more than we don't. We actually
wasn't it, in one of your books? It was so funny. You said something about how at one point they thought they knew everything about physics. Like, well, okay, we've wrapped that up. Physics, we've learned everything we can.
Yeah, the head of the Royal Society in 1900, a physicist, said that, and they were beginning to discourage students from going into physics at the time because there was nothing left to learn. So 9 months after the lecture where that was given, quantum mechanics was born, and a few years later, relativity was born. So it's a cautionary tale for someone that says this is impossible or we already know enough. Some months later, they will be found out to be wrong.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So when I'm reading your book and you talk about the powers of positive thinking and manifesting goals and all that as kind of like in a way of like a magic. And it kind of like hit me because there's been times where I've written stuff down and I've had this goal that seems ridiculous. And then somehow it happens. It almost seems like witchcraft. So explain this phenomenon of magical thinking or positive thinking.
Well, you're talking about the affirmations business. And it is part of the magical tradition. It goes into the 3 different kinds of practices of magic. As I lay out in my book, we're talking about my book, Real Magic. The 3 different ways that magic has been expressed over time is divination, which is perceiving through space and time. Lots of methods for that. Force of will, which is the affirmations business. And then theurgy, which is talking about spirits or communicating with them. So in terms of how is it possible for focused intentions to bring about the effect that you want? We're talking about manifestation. As best as we can tell, at least from laboratory studies, that when you apply your intention to a system of some type, a physical system, it changes the internal probabilities of that system. So in a larger scale, if you want to do something in your life and you are very clear about the outcome, you think about it and kind of push it into the future, it changes probabilistic events along the way, because from now to a nanosecond from now, everything's going to look pretty much the same. From now to 3 days from now, it could look very different. And it's because there's a million things that will happen between here and there. So if you think of now to the future as a whole bunch of branching decisions that are being made by you and by other people, if you had a way to slightly bias that you wanted to go this way versus that way, you could end up 3 days from now in a very different place than you are now if all of those decisions are made in the right way. So we see in the laboratory what looks like probabilistic shifts in like minor probabilistic shifts in equipment that we can build. And that on a larger scale is, I think, the way that I think of as how affirmations work. And that's like on a magical level. But even on a psychological level, it makes a lot of sense. If you tune your mind to start seeing red Volkswagens, you're going to start seeing a lot of red Volkswagens, not because you made them happen, but because they were there, but you weren't paying attention to it. So you take both the psychological priming and some magical concepts, and I think that's a way of thinking about how affirmations work.
Absolutely. And then meditation is another, that's a practice of kind of magic in a way, right? I mean, and that can make scientific differences in your physiology, right?
Yeah, but there we're beginning to understand that it's not magic. So I use the word magic as a placeholder for something happened that we don't have a good explanation for yet. In meditation, now the neuroscience of meditation is beginning to show that you can literally change the function and even morphology of your brain as a result of the meditative process. So at one time, it was probably considered kind of magical, but as science marches on, we're slowly beginning to understand how some of these things work.
Yeah, and that one's definitely got the science to back it up. What about the concept you mentioned this, and this is a fascinating concept: synchronicity. You taught in your book, you give example about how with the office space, you're next to someone else who's doing the same kind of research as you. What's behind this? This is kind of an interesting concept. What do you think is behind this, and from a scientific?
Well, in almost every question you're going to ask, the true answer is we don't actually know. So when I'm responding, I'm saying this is my best guess.
Yeah, that's what I mean. With your research, you have a better opinion than my opinion.
Okay, so synchronicity, I would say that in some cases, in the case of that I talk about in the book, is kind of a dual affirmation. Two people had an affirmation which caused their worlds to collide. So my need at the time was we found an office. It was empty, and I was trying to figure out what should the laboratory look like here? What should the offices look like? And I was drawing on a whiteboard in my office. Everything else was empty except for my office. I was drawing a whiteboard of what I imagined our laboratory should look like. Certain shielded rooms, certain equipment, certain whatever. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to me, in the room next door on the other side of the wall was somebody who was doing a magical practice. It's a yoga or a Tibetan dream yoga practice where he was trying to cause me to appear. He was trying to manifest me. The reason he was trying to make me show up is because he wanted me to help him in his business, and his business was doing cyber research, but from a commercial perspective. Ours, we were doing it just as a research project. We had no idea that he was there. He had no idea that we were here next to him because we didn't tell anybody, and we never even heard of this person before. So we were both doing something that would, from a affirmations perspective, cause us to be pulled together. Because one day he knocked on the door and he opened it and I was there. He wanted to manifest me. He was so shocked when I opened the door because he knew what I looked like and didn't like, I mean, you can imagine you want somebody to show up and the doorbell rings and they're there. Well, it took him a while to recover from that. And when I learned what he was doing, it took me a while to recover from that too, because what I was drawing on my whiteboard was in fact what was on the other side of the wall. It was the laboratory.
It is kind of spooky.
Yeah, it's spooky, and at the time it felt disorienting. Disorienting in the sense that I think I have free will. I think I've knocked on his door because I wanted to see who was in there. But from his perspective, no, I pulled you here. I made this happen. So the disorientation is, I think I'm in control of what I do, but maybe not completely. And from his perspective, too, he was doing this exercise because he had no other way of contacting me or even knowing where I was. Like at that point, this happens to be in Silicon Valley. Almost nobody knew I was in Silicon Valley. And no one can, oh, now somebody's rung our doorbell. It would be really strange if you showed up at our front door, given that I'm seeing you on Zoom right now.
Yeah. No, but the chances of you guys getting offices in the same building and across from each other, I mean, it's pretty astronomical, right?
Yeah. Very, very few people are doing cyber search from a scientific or technical perspective. The fact that we would, unbeknownst to either of us, end up being literally next door to each other is, well, I don't know how to figure out that probability, but it's pretty darn low.
Yeah, no. And so, I mean, just to even add to this credibility, you worked for the government. The government is, I found that fascinating, that the government is not only US government, but also China and Russia are all doing experiments on, explain the concept of remote viewing to my listeners.
Well, remote viewing is a fancy new term for clairvoyance, perception through space and time. And so the US government for 20 years had a classified program of psychic espionage, using clairvoyance to do espionage on adversaries. At the time, we suspected but did not know that Russia had a similar program. Later, we learned that they in fact did. We don't know for sure that China either had or has a program, but I'd be very surprised if they did not. I also know that other countries were tracking at least what we were doing in the US as closely as they could. So one time I gave a talk to government people in Australia, and I found out that they knew we had a classified program. They didn't know the details of it, but they knew that we had the program. Well, how would they know that? It was secret. There were portions that were top secret. I don't know. Somebody tells tales, even in this clandestine world, and they knew that we were investigating these kinds of things. So I suspect that intelligence services around the world are always kind of keeping track of new developments. In this case, the reason why the US government got involved was primarily because of the possibility of threat. Like if it turned out this stuff is real, that clairvoyance really can do this, and we have rumors that the Russians are doing it, well, we had better find out whether there's a threat here or not. So part of what we were doing was threat analysis from the Russians and the Chinese. We found it's very likely that the phenomena are real. Now we know pretty sure, yeah, it is real. Is it a threat? Well, kind of. It's kind of a threat in the sense that when what you don't want an adversary to find out are things that you consider to be secret because they provide a security advantage. We learned pretty quickly, though, that you can't keep secrets from clairvoyance. And so that is a threat. But we also found out there's no way we could figure out to effectively block it either, which is even a greater threat. So if you have secret information inside a sealed safe somewhere with code words and so on, that should be completely isolated from the rest of the world, except a really good clairvoyant or remote viewer can get that information. So we don't know how to block it. You can deflect it a little bit, but you can't block gaining that kind of information. If you think about the consequences of there being no secrets between countries and no secrets in the government and no secrets anywhere, that would be a very different kind of civilization than what we have now. Because our government, our laws, everything relies on secrecy. I mean, imagine the judicial system if there was no secrecy, right? You'd have no need to do courtrooms because people would already know what the answer is. So this is one of the challenges. It's one of the reasons I think that there's a continuing taboo against these kinds of things, because you really start to think about it, that your thoughts, your behavior are not completely isolated. They're not really just part of you. It's part of a collective. It's both frightening and challenging to the way that the world currently works. So I think there's some pressure to don't look at that. Don't study that too deeply because it would shake up things too much. Some of it is probably related to that. There are also objections from people who are very religious. In Catholicism, for example, all of this stuff is considered demonic unless it's within the bounds of the church. Like a priest can do magical things, but a layperson cannot.
Yeah, that's too bad. Yeah, there's definitely some roadblocks there. So yeah, the government says that this program ended in 95, but do you think it's still going on? Maybe just called something else now, or I guess we'll find out later probably if it is.
Yeah, you find out about classified things 20 years after they finish. I don't know if there's a classified program now. I kind of suspect that there is not, but I do suspect that there are people who are hired as consultants on specific cases, because everybody's involved in law enforcement and intelligence and so on. They get the best data that they can, but they can't always get the data that they want. So some people are really good as psychic detectives, or sometimes mediums are really good at that. And especially in cold cases, they will find somebody who they strike up a friendship with, who they can then trust to not blab about it. And sometimes they provide useful information for solving cold cases. So this is the sort of thing, there's a giggle factor associated with this because of the way it's portrayed in the media. But people who's like detectives, whose job is to figure out how something happened, if somebody can give them a tip, they're going to use that tip. And especially if somebody has a track record of providing good tips, they will definitely use them.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah. And then the other thing that the government did was the MK Ultra. That was different than the remote viewing, right? Is that a different project? But they were trying to, it's almost like brainwashing or something.
Yeah, well, MK Ultra was in the 50s mostly as methods of looking into mind control. So they're using LSD and other nefarious methods to control people through drugs and other means. It had absolutely nothing to do with psychic espionage, because in the program that I worked on, it relied on people who are already very talented.
Mm-hmm.
They're talented psychics. In the MK Ultra, they were trying to manipulate behavior and what people thought, which is very different.
Mm-hmm.
And MK Ultra was shut down, and most of that is understood now about what happened. And it actually changed the law in the United States about how you deal with human subjects and experiments. So there's all kinds of laws now and procedures that you have to follow to prevent that kind of thing from happening again.
Yeah, that's probably a good thing. And then you talk about in your book about this woman who was the president of the Statistical Association. She worked with parapsychology and some sort of top secret government experiment during the Cold War. And she showed that the data for precognition was statistically significant. And this is the president of the Statistical Association. So that's got to be some proof right there.
Well, remember, we don't deal with proof.
Or
we
what would
deal
you call
with
it?
evidence.
Evidence. Sorry.
Yeah. So you're talking about Jessica Utz, who is now past president of the American Statistical Association. It's completely mainstream. It's an international association of people who specialize in evaluating data. That's why she was part of the same program that I was in, now called Stargate, but it had many other names to it. So yeah, she was asked to evaluate the remote viewing data by the CIA and the DIA and a few other agencies to give an assessment from a statistical perspective, is this real or not? And the bottom line is, she said, yeah, these data are not chance, they're not due to fraud, they're not due to any of the other known reasons. As best as we can tell, this is a real phenomenon. So that's from a scientific perspective. The flip side of that is it useful for espionage? So let's say, you could have a real effect that's like 1% over chance. You have high confidence, you know it's real, but is it useful at that level? Well, it turns out that remote viewing, and for experts, is way above 1% above chance. It's far above that. And more importantly, it was useful in missions that were undertaken as a result of gaining this kind of information. So in the intelligence world, you never rely on one source. It's too dangerous. Mm-hmm. But if you get a lot of sources that are beginning to point to the same thing, and one of those is remote viewing data is also saying something, then the information is used and the missions usually are successful, or at least they can do a viable mission because they have enough information.
What's the highest percentage that you've seen of a psychic in terms of Was there a number that you could apply to that in terms of how often that they can more than chance that they'd be right about things?
Well, so a really good remote viewer will get veridical information, meaning that it can be checked later and found to be correct, maybe 30% of the time. So at least 70% of the time where there's some uncertainty. So between 30%, which is vertical, there's another 30%, which is in the domain, like correct, but not exactly correct. And about 30% of it will be wrong. So the challenge then is, can they tell when they're right versus wrong? Well, the answer is no, because otherwise it'd be right 100% of the time.
Right.
So we're dealing here with impressions that are very similar to something like a hypnagogic feeling that you would have. And as you're falling asleep, you're starting to get dream imagery. And if you can remain awake long enough, you can start to see all kinds of things happening. So that's sort of the impressionistic way that remote viewing comes in. And the experts then can kind of freeze it. They can freeze it long enough to actually examine these impressions. And after a while, with a lot of practice and some talent, they can begin to discriminate between this is me, like I'm making up this thing, versus this really is coming from somewhere else.
So it's kind of like seeing a dream, and they just have better, because we all dream and we all see things when we dream, but they have better control over it.
And also a sense of where is this information coming from? Is it, and one of the ways that, at least that Russell Targ would talk about this, and he was one of the co-founders of the government program, he would say that if you're doing a remote viewing test, you look for the surprising elements, right? So like in a dream, you're not often surprised, right? You're in the dream is happening. Even a lucid dream where you're aware that you're dreaming, there's not often that many times of surprises. But if you're doing a remote viewing exercise and you learn, among other things, that you don't name what you're looking at, you get an impression, or automatic impulse is to name what that is. So let's say there's some target hidden in an envelope somewhere, and your job is to figure out what that is. So you do a remote viewing, you get flashes of yellow, getting yellow stuff, things that look yellow. Well, the moment I say that, certain kinds of objects will come to mind. It's a banana. It's a rain slicker. It's things that are yellow, because there are not that many things that are yellow out there. When you do that, you're already overriding what the impression actually is. So naming something pulls it into a different way of thinking about things. And so really good remote viewers in the early stages will learn to capture the raw impression. It's like sensory impressions. I got a sense of something yellow. I have no idea what it is. I don't even know if it's important in this, but it keeps coming up in different ways, and I'm getting certain motions and certain other sensory things. Eventually, with practice, you begin to see how it all fits together. So it's almost as though you have a target, somebody breaks it up into 1,000 pieces like a jigsaw puzzle, and you're getting pieces of the puzzle, and you're trying to put it together. So you might get a piece that's all yellow. And you don't want to say it's a banana, because it turns out it has nothing to do with that. It might be a sunset or something. You pull in the pieces and you begin to reassemble after a while. And it takes a lot of practice to figure out how to do that, because it's not something we ordinarily do. But you can get to a point where where the really talented people can give you a description, which is essentially like a photograph.
And especially if they had, like if China had a whole team of people and they're getting tons of different jigsaw pieces from tons of different people, then they could put all those pieces together more easily, right?
It would be nice if that was the way that it worked. And we're not quite sure that it does that. And the reason is that you could have a whole bunch of people doing a remote viewing, and they could all show very strong agreement among each other and all be wrong.
Interesting.
And so one of the reasons is that some targets are more difficult to get than others. So if you have, let's say in so-called psychic space, your mind is out there, you're looking at the universe. And so the target may be something as simple as a piece of paper with a picture on it or something like that. But right next to the target, and you don't even know this because this is happening, you're targeting something 1,000 miles away, right next to the piece of paper that you want to see is something nice and shiny and colorful and moving and emotionally interesting. So when your psychic eye is looking around for the target, because you're not told to look at a piece of paper somewhere, you're just given a pointer. There is a target of interest that we want to know about. So you might get close to it, but then you get distracted. And so that's a kind of a camouflage that is conceivably possible to use to reduce the effectiveness of remote viewing. You have a target you want to hide, and you put all kinds of interesting things around it that would act as a distractor.
Interesting. It's fascinating stuff. Well, tell my listeners about some of the experiments that you have done. You said, you like doing the more experiments rather than the field work. So like you have the one with the Buddhist monks and the blessed chocolate and the blessed tea and the non-tea.
Yeah. So this is in a series of experiments looking at the role of intention in the physical world. It's about mind-matter interaction. In the vernacular, it would be called a psychokinetic experiment. So in a series of experiments with Buddhist monks in Taiwan, who are very fortunate that they were willing to play the game with us, they imprinted into water a blessing or an idea that anyone who drank the water would have a better mood. And so we used that water to make tea. We got 200 people in the experiment, and in a double-blind fashion, the tea that had been blessed was drunk by the people, and the same number of people drank it with unblessed tea, all from the same source. And we found a significant improvement in mood in the people who drank the intentionally imprinted tea. We did the same with chocolate. We later did a similar experiment where we used the blessed water to grow little plants. These are called Arabidopsis thaliana plants, like a little mustard plant. And they grew significantly better. And we just finished and just published a study doing the same thing with stem cells. So you can get, if you take dental pulp, you extract a tooth, you take the pulp out, you can grow stem cells from that. They're adult stem cells. They're used in all kinds of applications. And so what we did is made growth medium out of the blessed water versus controlled water. And what the intention was, things growing in this medium would grow better. That was the blessing. And sure enough, we got more proliferation of stem cells in the growth medium with the blessed water than with the controlled water.
It'd be an interesting one is if you did the different religions, like maybe do Buddhist and Catholicism and like all the different, see if there was a difference there. If it was just the intention is the same, it doesn't make a difference where it comes from.
Yeah, we thought about that, and then we immediately dropped that idea because we don't want to get into religious wars. But more importantly, it seems it's very unlikely it has anything to do with the religion.
Right.
The reason
that's my point.
Yeah. The reason we chose Buddhist monks is because people in that profession are spending hours a day meditating for years. And so they're able to hold very strong, focused attention and intention, which seems to be the factor in whether these things work well or not. You can trace it all the way through the magical traditions that's also the case, that you need to do ritual or meditation or certain psychedelics, all of which are pulling you into a state of mind where you're able to apply focused intention at a level which is very not normal, let's say, much higher focus than usual. And they're apparently able to do that.
Well, what about, I just got back from New Orleans not too long ago, and I'm really fascinated with voodoo. Now, you did an experiment with voodoo dolls where you, what was it? Like you massage some of the dolls. I don't know. Explain this. Yeah. Explain this experiment. This is because voodoo is so fascinating to me.
Yeah. So this was an experiment that falls into a class that's called DMILS. That's the acronym, Direct Mental Interactions with Living Systems. In the old days, we used to call it bio-PK, a biopsychokinetic effect. So it's the idea that one mind can influence another person's body. And there's many studies looking at that in various different forms, like feeling of being stared at. And they work. You can isolate two people really well and have one pay attention to the other and measure physiological changes. So it was in that context that we did the study on voodoo. The only portion of it that was really voodoo-like is that each person in the experiment made a little effigy doll of themselves,
Mm-hmm.
which they put a little bit of their hair on it and they put their name on it and they tried to paint it so it would look like themselves. And then that's you. You made the doll. So you give the doll to, first of all, you isolate this person now in a room and you measure their physiology. And then you have somebody at a distance who has your doll and has to do something to it. So we were thinking, oh, good, well, we'll push pins into it. And we thought, who wants to be in an experiment where somebody is pushing a pin into your voodoo doll? Well, none of us wanted to do that. But we had to have some kind of interaction. So we said, okay, let's give the doll a massage, because in most people, that will produce a known physiological response. You become relaxed. So we can measure that just as easily as becoming activated. So we did that and it worked. It worked really well. It worked so well that we did it twice and then we decided we're never going to do that again. I mean, because if you can cause somebody at a distance, like you're massaging a little doll and something like that is happening to the distant person, well, the flip side of it probably could happen too.
With the pins.
Yeah, with pins. Now, what's different in classic magical voodoo is that the person that you're making the doll of does not know that you've made the doll, right? So there's all these ideas about surreptitiously getting some hair from the person and something to connect with that person. So I kind of guess that in some real world cases that people could make dolls and actually influence somebody at a distance. Fortunately, the size of the effects that we see, at least in the laboratory, are pretty small. Like the target person might not know that they're being influenced, but physiologically, you can measure way below the level of awareness. And that's where we were able to see these effects.
Right. So again, it goes back to that dramatic, like when you watch a movie, you know, the guy would pass out or have a heart attack. That's probably not going to happen, but you could do something that would be noticeable.
You might be able to, if they'd noticed anything, they would notice their heartbeat maybe a little faster, or maybe they feel a little anxious or something like that, but not much more than that.
What about near-death experiences? I know you mentioned one person that kind of flips their beliefs on some of this stuff because they had a near-death experience. That's always a fascinating thing to go through and kind of, it kind of goes into that conscious, global consciousness.
Well, for perfectly reasonable reasons, a lot of people are skeptical about these things because they haven't had such an experience. For somebody who does have such an experience, they're no longer skeptical because only a crazy person would deny their own experience. Now, some people may not want to talk about it. In fact, a lot of people don't want to talk about their strange experiences for fear of being thought off the beam. But sometimes people will admit it. And oftentimes, for me at least, since I get a lot of these stories by email, that people will say, I've never told anyone this before. And they write back and say, oh, it's an interesting experience. Have you told people in your family? No, nobody. They didn't tell their wife, they didn't tell their husband, their children. Nobody knows that they had an experience, which is actually pretty common. And other people in their family probably have had it too. They just don't talk about it for this idea of it seems too strange somehow, which is a pity, really, because it only sustains the taboo that there's something weird about it. Well, it's not something weird. All of the evidence that we know is that the vast majority of people have the capacity to have these experiences. And many, many people have had at least one experience of this type.
But with the near-death experiences specifically, because some people say that's hallucinations from the brain.
Yeah.
What is your theory based on the research that you've done on that? What is your theory is what's really going on there?
Well, so there's two schools of thought. One is that, is it a result of lack of oxygen in the brain or some other mundane explanation, like DMT is released in the brain or something like that? I'm pretty well convinced from the people I know who have studied these things that it is not those explanations. It doesn't fit. Because if somebody was not getting enough oxygen, their memory of the event and their ability to be clear about what was happening very quickly degrades. And that's not what happens in these things. These are memories that persist at very high clarity for the rest of their life. So people have actually been interviewed after an NDE and then 20 years later, and their stories compared, and it's the same story. It's like there's no confabulation happening or memory distortion. It was such a dramatic event that they remember it very clearly, and other things like that. So is it hallucination, distortions, all that? In some cases, it might be, but I think overall there are enough cases where the experience of separating from the body is something that is as close to what we think happened as they can report. So this is like the mainstream view within how to interpret near-death experience. When somebody has a near-death experience and they start reporting about going into the tunnel and seeing departed loved ones and having all kinds of experiences, there's no way to check that. So it becomes an interesting story, but we unless we can confirm it some way, then it remains a story. I mean, it's clearly a story that changed their life, but it's not going to convince anybody else. So the one area of near-death experience that is thought to be objectively verifiable is when somebody goes out of body, is say in an operatory or after an accident, and they are floating above the scene and they look down and they can see things which they later report, which turns out to be true, like how they were resuscitated, what people were wearing, all kinds of things. There's a different interpretation of what's going on there. So it's possible that they are really separated somehow and their awareness is elsewhere. It's also possible, though, that even though their EEG might be flatlined, so it looks like their brain is totally dead, it's not working at all, and kind of bypassing the idea that we know that the brain actually takes a while to settle down to really go flatline. So when an EEG is picking up is surface level, but there's all kinds of activity going on for quite a while. So let's ignore that and assume that when your cortex goes flatline, you're gone, even though that may not be true. So if it is gone, and people said, oh, I was flatlined, and yet I saw these things happening during the surgery, how is that possible? Well, one thing we know about psychic phenomena is that anything that pulls you out of your ordinary state of awareness, psi abilities go up. This is why you get much more psychic things happening in the dream state and after drumming and dancing and psychedelics and whatever. It's your ordinary state of awareness is kind of locking you in here, and all these other states allows you to expand. Well, think about a state of awareness that is more dramatic than in the process of dying or the process of being resuscitated. So in the process of dying, the psychic ability, which perceived through space and time, might well jump out of what amounts to our current timeline and see something interesting happening in their future, like a surgeon doing something that they didn't expect. Well, then they're dead, and nothing's happening when they're dead. And later they're resuscitated, and they remember what they got before they were dead, right? So the question I'm talking about here is, when did the report happen? So my sense is that when somebody has a near-death experience, the experience they're having is when they're in the process of dying or the process of being resuscitated. It is not happening during the time when they're considered to be clinically dead. So I don't know that that's the case. I'm just saying that as a plausibility argument, we actually don't have any way of knowing that an experience that happened when somebody was flatlined was actually when they were flatlined. There's no way to report that because they can't respond when they're dead. Mm-hmm. So this is a minority opinion among people who study near-death experience, because they would rather believe that we actually can persist without the body. I would like to believe that too, except when I start thinking about the way that I know that we see psychic things happening in the laboratory, we know that it's not tightly bound in space or time. We know that it gets a lot better when you're pulled away from ordinary states of awareness. So a near-death experience from that context begins to look more like it's not that you're really separated from your body, it's more that you become suddenly really psychic and can see things that are not yet, that haven't happened yet.
Okay.
So, like vanilla precognition.
Okay, that's an interesting take on that. So then when it comes to psychics and mediums, instead of doing remote viewing, communicating with the dead. Now you even acknowledge in your book that there are a lot that are frauds. flat out, there are a lot of them that use cold reading techniques and things like that. But the ones that are legit, talk about that. How do they do that? How does that work? Is there experiments that you've done in your laboratory with that?
Yeah. So we know from experiments, double and triple blind experiments to prevent things like cold reading. We know that some mediums who are talented can get information about departed loved ones that is verifiably correct. And so the way that you prevent cold reading is typically you use something called a proxy sitter. So a medium is working with a person, their client is called a sitter. The proxy sitter is somebody who's simply standing in for the sitter. And that proxy doesn't know anything about the departed loved ones. They're just like a lab assistant or something. They sit there generally because mediums like to deal with a person. But even though this person doesn't know, it's like in remote viewing, you don't tell somebody, tell me what's in that building over there. You give them something like 6 random letters and say, this stands for the thing that we want to find out. And somehow in psychic space, the association is made between this target or this proxy sitter and the thing that you want to get. That's how you keep it, the psychic or the medium blind to the target. So there can't be any ordinary way of figuring it out. So in one type of design, let's say you have 2 people who are the actual sitters. You have Bob, who's interested in his departed loved ones, and you have Mike, who's interested in his departed loved ones. So you have a proxy sitter in both cases. You tell the medium, okay, tell us about this person's departed loved ones, say Bob. So they say a bunch of stuff, you write a transcript. So you write down what they said. Do the same thing for Mike. You have another transcript. So now you have 2 transcripts. You give both of them to Mike and both of them to Bob and say, given based on the transcript, which one do you think that is what the medium was actually telling your story? Because they won't know anything about the other person, but they will know about their person. So in you doing that kind of experiment, you come out with very simple responses, like they got it right or they didn't get it right. You have to do a lot of trials. And when you do those experiments, a good medium will get it right statistically more often than expected by chance. So chance in that sense would be 50%. Good mediums can get 60%, perhaps. On average, over a bunch of mediums, you might get 55%. So it's a little bit over chance, but statistically speaking, it's definitely not chance.
Mm-hmm. Who are some good psychics or mediums? Can you say the names of some that are they out there for the public to reach out to? Or
I think the only one I'll mention is Joe McMonagle, who was a remote viewer 001 in the government program, because he's been very open about his experiences, lots of interviews, wrote a number of good books on this topic. There's certainly others out there. For mediums, when we've worked with maybe 24 mediums, generally we go through an institute called Windbridge Institute, which was devoted to the study of survival type phenomena. And for a long time, they had a method for certifying whether a medium, first of all, would want to participate in research. And second of all, they developed double and triple blind protocols to test if they were actually any good. So they're listed on the Windbridge site, and we've worked with a number of them. For the others, generally, we work by asking around for recommendations, because oftentimes, if you get a good reputation on somebody and they were doing it as a professional for some time, they wouldn't stay in that profession for very long if they weren't good. Mm-hmm. So those are the people we invite to the lab, and they have to be willing to do things in laboratory controls. In general, we find interesting results with those people.
So do you think some of the TV mediums, are those doing more of the cold reading stuff then, or?
It's really difficult to know what goes on when they do the audience style readings.
Yeah.
Because then it opens the possibility that they could be doing, I'm getting something about somebody with a J in their name. Really? I mean, in a large enough audience, you're always going to get something like that. So sure. That's why we don't rely on that kind of performance to know what's happening. It's always one person, one reading, one person that's being read under conditions where we know that there's a separation, that they can't tell who the sitter is or anything about them.
Okay, well, great. This has been great stuff. People need to check out the books for more. I read Real Magic was great, and then I'm almost finished with Entangled Minds. I think I have like one more chapter left on that one. Great, fascinating stuff. I love that there's research behind all this. I think that's the most important thing, that backs everything up what you're saying. So great stuff. I like to end each episode with a charity. Can people donate to your research, or is there another cause that you are passionate about that people could donate to after they've bought your books, of course?
Well, I work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is a 501c3 charity. We do all of our work based on donations.
Okay.
So membership is something like $65 to be a member. We have maybe 75,000 members. And then higher end donors as well who fund everything that we do.
Perfect.
So
Well,
we don't get any government funding. Let's put it that way.
Of course. Well, I'll put it all in the notes, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Fascinating stuff.
My pleasure.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye. Okay. So what do you think? Lots of interesting topics and some great research being done by Dr. Dean Radin. I almost have more questions than answers, so I may have to have him on the show again. So many things we didn't get to. We didn't hardly even talk about UFOs and aliens, and so many other questions and different kinds of discussions we could have had. We really could have talked for hours. But what do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments below if you're watching on YouTube. And while you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I am very close to getting that goal of 1,000 subscribers, and you can help me get there. If you're not on YouTube, you can comment and follow on social media, and that way you won't miss any future episodes. I'm all over there. I don't think Dr. Radin is on social media that I can find, but you can click the link in the show notes for his website, and you can make a donation to his research. His books are available everywhere on Amazon. I listened to 2 of them on Audible. Very good stuff. And thank you all for taking the time to listen to this episode and supporting my show. I appreciate you all. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And remember, shoot for the moon.